Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I'm joined by Jake Hofer to discuss best practices for planning out your year of upcoming wildlife habitat improvements. All right, welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative. And today we are continuing to kick off 2025 by looking forward into the new year and planning out what this new year might hold. Last week, Tony and I were kind of talking about our own personal plans. This week on the show, I want to look forward towards things on a wildlife habitat improvement kind of scale. Land management, how we can improve things for our deer hunting, for the biodiversity, for wildlife, or recreation, whatever your goals are. That's what we are exploring today. How do we put a plan in place? How do we prioritize our projects? How do we choose the right things to work on? How do we do that in an effective way? And my guest today is someone who's really going to be able to help us do that. This is Jake Hofer. He is the host of The Land Podcast, owner of the Whitetail Master Academy. Previously was a host of the Exodus Trail Cam Radio podcast and ran their YouTube stuff over there and create all sorts of great content in the hunting and management space. And today he is going to share his experience both as a landowner and habitat manager himself, as well as being somebody who has interviewed and toured farms of and sold farms for and learned from all sorts of great deer and land managers themselves. He's been able to kind of pick the brains of some of the best when it comes to this stuff: land improvement, land management, improving things for whitetail habitat and wildlife habitat. Jake's been able to cover it all. He's chatted with the best out there. And so what I wanted to pick his brain about was two things. Number one, his experience, what's worked for him. And then secondly, what he has learned from those best of the best and how those might be applied, or how we can apply those lessons to our own experiences. So that's the game plan today. And that is what I think we should just jump right into rather than beating around the bush. So here is my chat with Jake Hofer. All right, with me on the line now is Jake Hofer. Jake, how are you?
Doing well. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too, man. I'm glad we're kicking off the new year here together, talking about something we both enjoy, which is getting out there on the landscape, doing some good work, getting the hands dirty. How much have you been able to give thought to the next year yet? Are you kind of still recuperating from New Year's Eve festivities and the last hunting season and all that? Or are you already like chomping at the bit thinking about 25?
I don't think it ever stops, to tell you the truth. And I was in bed by 10 o'clock on New Year's Eve too. But it never really stops. And I think that, now that a lot of seasons are wrapping up, it's when the rubber meets the road and you start executing on some of those plans. And, I had a really fun and exciting season, and I bucked out here in Illinois. I think it was the third weekend of December. And that's a weird feeling. I haven't done that since 2017. I was like, man, I'm done. Like I can't even, I can scout and I can drive around and just pretend I'm hunting and glass deer, but that was a weird feeling in itself. And so it's actually kind of bottled up more excitement to get out there and start doing work. And it's always a challenge too, because everything whitetail hunting is hurry and wait in a lot of ways. And so as much as I want to go back there and start working, behind my house, I have a bunch of standing food. And it's like, man, I don't really want to booger the deer. It'd be nice to find some sheds and just trying to figure out what can I do, or, just go ahead and work on this place and leave the other place alone. I mean, it's always a challenge, but yeah, I'm super excited to enjoy some of these cold months and run the chainsaw, be outside and get a little bit of vitamin D as we all get pale and pasty during the winter.
Man, thank goodness there's an excuse like that, getting out there on the landscape at this time of year, because if you're just stuck in the office the whole time, it can be brutal. So I got a question for you. Just for context, how much ground do you have that you actually can do work on yourself?
I would say a little over 100 acres, probably between 100 and 115 with free rein. And that's across 3 different farms. So not a huge scale, but more than I ever could have dreamed of growing up. So, I mean, it's I've had the pleasure of being on some incredible farms that are just like, oh my gosh. And then there's other people with the land podcast for guys, they want to buy 10 acres, 20 acres. So I realize how blessed I am to be able to have that amount of ground to work on, but just enough to where you can scratch a lot of different itches. And what's interesting where I live versus the other farm, they're almost two completely different types of farms. Where I live, it's kind of an oak savanna. To the west of me is where it used to be all prairie, and this is like one of the last little slivers of timber. So this is a much different type of ecosystem, much better soils than the other farm where it's more bluff country and it's pretty rugged. And they're not very far apart, but you go to one farm and work one day and go to the other one, it feels like you're working on two completely different types of projects and landscapes, which is actually really exciting. And it wasn't really a strategic thing initially, but after I had both, I was like, oh man, yeah, that's kind of cool that they're completely different and you get to try different practices on both of them.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that seems like a sweet spot. Your 100 to 150 acres, that seems like a realistic size for a lot of people. And still, it's for some people, like you said, that would feel like a ton of ground. On the other side, it's not so much more than a 40 or a 50 that what you're experiencing there, it's certainly still relatable to someone who's got 40 or 50 or 20 or 70. That seems to be the window that a lot of folks can someday aspire towards. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one's a 40, one's a 60, and another one is a really small one, between 5 and 10 acres. And so, yeah, they're very relatable. These farms are as real as like the issues everyone faces across the board. But I'm not immune to those, and that's all part of the fun.
Yeah. So you talked about this kind of conundrum that you've got right now, which is you want to get working on things, but at the same time, you don't want to put too much pressure on your properties when there's standing food out there that you left specifically so that deer would and wildlife would use your landscape now, maybe drop antlers, maybe overwinter, whatever it is. So how do you think about, when you come into the new year, what does your process look like when it comes to putting that plan together? Do you have a calendar almost where you come into a given year and you say, okay, these months I'm doing this, these months I'm doing this, or is it kind of, every year is a little bit different? What's that look like for you?
Yeah, it's all a little bit different based off of, I utilize the EQIP contracts, the NRCS, quite a bit. And so that has different parameters and timelines of when you need to do things, and obviously the preparation in order to do the work. And so some of that, helps you plan things out by the structure of that. And actually, I bought the Land and Legacy calendar that Ryan Kirby designed that artwork. And every now and then I look at that and like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. I should, that's in the calendar of when to do and what to do. And not that usually you need ideas to go. There's always more to do than what you have time for, but sometimes that's a fun little thing. But I mean, this time of year, I really like to tackle the invasive species. So, hack and squirt honeysuckle, cut the stumps and treat it with Garlon 4 and kill out the honeysuckle. And that I've done like different pockets at my house and try to hit a pocket each year. And because the common theme that a lot of people say is, yeah, you take all that out, all the cover is gone on your farm. If that's the best cover on your farm, you take all of it out at once, it's all gone. So I've actually done different pockets where one year I'll take it all out. The next spring I'll plant native trees and shrubs and help get that established, and then go to a different part of the farm and start working on that. So this is a really good time of year for that. And the other thing too is it's a great time to get out and walk your farm very methodically and maybe not looking for shed antlers. Because man, every shed hunt I have turns into a scouting mission. I'm like, I don't really want to find antlers that bad. What went on over here? And you look for sign and keep really detailed notes. I know if I don't write it down, I'll probably forget it. And so I get a hard time for some of my friends. Like you go too fast. Like when you walk a farm, you're just gone. Like I look up, next thing you're over another hill over, and I just get too fast. And so I have to constantly tell myself, slow down. Why do I think this bed is here? What wind was he maybe using this on? How could I improve my access from this bed? Can he see me walk in, or can these deer watch me walk in? And really slow down and take a minute to process all that information, because it's really easy to like, oh yeah, there's a bed. Oh, there's a rub. There's a scrape. And you just look at it at face value. I've done this for a very long time, but take a minute to really slow down. So that's probably the number one thing to do this time of year, regardless if you're planning projects or walking public ground or permission ground. So that's probably the biggest thing. And the invasives, I've interviewed a lot of different people, and I've asked this question specifically to a variety of different folks of it's almost a debate in the land management world of, do you leave it or do you replace it?
Yeah.
And I think I fall on the side of, I would just go ahead and replace it with something that is native and good. but a lot of guys don't have patience to watch that develop. I planted trees and they bed in it a little bit, but I've walked farms that where that tree planting is 5 to 12 years old. And those are the farms where your hair on the back of your neck stand up with really great sign. And the only way you get that is if you take 5 or 12 years to plant the trees and do all that. And I think that the debate of native warm season grasses or planting trees, I have this conversation with guys all the time. I'm a tree guy. I like planting the trees. It's a lot more work. It takes longer, but I think it changes the landscape in a better way. But the warm season grasses, if you're impatient, it happens faster. So, I mean, those are some of the biggest things. And I think TSI is obviously a great time of year to do TSI as well, reducing crappy trees, bad trees, inferior trees, and letting crop trees come into more sunlight and grow faster. And that, I mean, all these things have so many different wormholes where I've talked to different TSI guys, and even one of them specifically was Adam Keith with Land of Legacy. I said, out of all the farms you go walk for, you guys are doing a client visit, and the guy says, hey, I did TSI on this farm. How often do you look at the TSI and say, yeah, you did a good job? And he said, maybe 1 out of 10. Yeah.
Yikes.
So it's like, okay, well, where's the gap in communication here where there's all these different things? But I don't want people to get paralyzed with not starting a project, because I think that we all cannot start every project with all the answers and know everything. Like, you just have to get going. And that's been what I've done. And I think another side of things of just different projects of planting trees in the spring. One year, we bought this originally like 3 years ago in the fall, and I was so excited just to plant trees in the spring. Like, I got to do it. And I planted a bunch of trees in brome and fescue, and they're not any bigger than what they are when I planted 3 years ago. So I realized, okay, you have to do the prep work, get rid of the grass that's going to choke out all the trees and shrubs that you planted. And then I did that the following year, and those trees are all like already 2 or 3 times bigger than the ones I planted much further in the background. So I think all these different things, we want to rush and get them done and kind of just do it to get it done and put it off the checklist. But maybe going into some of these projects this upcoming year, maybe make it your point to educate yourself on how to do it as best or as close to right as you can the first time, rather than watch a video on YouTube and, hey, I'm going to do TSI. And you don't really know how to do tree identification, or you're not really sure what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of those are pretty big decisions that you don't get to undo. And so, I mean, that's a lot there, but those are just some of the things that are top of mind, that mistakes I've made and things I've learned from other people and things that I've implemented. And the other thing too is the off season goes fast.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you're talking about there, though, is there's this temptation to want to do everything right now, right? We want it all, and we want it now. But I think that, to your point, can oftentimes lead to us rushing things, not doing the real prep work that we needed to do, not doing things the right way. And then in the long run, the payoff is half what it could have been if we just would have slowed down and made some better decisions. So I'm imagining that one of the antidotes to that is simply better prioritizing and planning what projects to do at a given time. Instead of maybe trying to do 12 big things this year, maybe doing 4 things really well versus 12 things half-assed.
Mm-hmm.
So number 1, am I right about that? And number 2, if so, how do you go about prioritizing and choosing, what is the best use of my time this year, or what should be in my list for 2025? Because like you said, there's 1,000 things that could be on that list on any given year. How do we pick the right things and doing them at the right times?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this is going to be no surprise to anyone, but the improving your access is such a big part of that. And so ideally, you would have sprayed this last fall to prepare to plant switchgrass or whatever other screening you planned on doing. And I think that for this upcoming spring, you can continue to spray it and prepare it for either a frost seed, or maybe, I mean, there's the debate if you can spray it multiple times in the spring and do a late June planting of switchgrass. That's a possibility for sure, depending on what you're working with. And so I think planning your access is probably the biggest improvement that you can make, and making pockets throughout your farm just to make the deer feel more comfortable and direct traffic. I think that's the biggest thing, because you're going to get more use out of your farm and not scare as many deer coming in and out. And you also kind of funnel the deer where you want to go, or at least encourage them to do what you want a lot easier with just some of those edges. And so this year, this is a good example. Last year, I did a lot of prep work to plant switchgrass, and I frost seeded the switchgrass last February. And so this is a 1-year stand. Next to that 1-year stand, I planted a 1-year annual screen to still accomplish the access. And then once the switchgrass gets established, I'm going to take out the annual screen and extend my food plot. And I think that's a really quick and easy way to accomplish both buckets all in the same year. And
Yeah.
I think some of the other things too, when it comes to TSI, is guys just get really excited. And I think it's a very powerful method to improve a parcel. However, a lot of guys, I think, forget once again, the prep work of getting rid of the undesirable species before you flush open the canopy, and then you have a bigger mess to fight. And it's really tempting to think like, it can't be that bad. It can be. It can be if you don't do it. So I mean, I think those are just those are some of the biggest things, is just nailing down the access, figuring out how to maybe improve something as simple as a mock scrape, or some of these little tiny projects that can make a big impact for your upcoming season. And I think just the biggest thing that it always boils down to is access and trying to put the deer where you can hunt them effectively. And I think that is something that is a common thread with name whatever whitetail expert. If you could just really boil down what their thesis is, it's improve the access, scare less deer, and have higher opportunity stand locations. Easy to say, hard to do if you don't really have a really good plan.
Yeah. So with that being the case, and access being one of the first things you recommend somebody look at, you shared one example of how you've been working on improving access. What's on your to-do list for 2025? What projects have you prioritized as being the things that you're going to get done this year?
Yeah, so access is on another farm. It's there's an area, I remember walking it last year and grabbing cameras, and this exactly happened, where I found a bunch of beds looking exactly where I park. Okay, something has to happen.
That's a problem.
And unfortunately, I identified that last year. I didn't get it done. And so that's something that's just number one on my project list this upcoming year. Another good example is last couple of years, I've planted about 4,000 trees where I live, and over 3,000 of those have been by hand. And the reason I've done that is I just don't like straight rows. And I remember watching a video and reading a scientific study that animals don't like straight row tree plantings. It's like, okay, I'm not going to do that. And so I've basically been creating a forest by hand, and which has been really cool. But the thing of this is, I plan on planting another 2,000 trees. It's old cattle pasture, brome and fescue. And I've made that mistake previously, where the trees just don't grow as rapidly as they should. And so this past year, I have sprayed all of that down to prepare for the upcoming, not this spring, but the following spring. And this year I'm going to plant basically a Pheasants Forever and Hoxie Native Seed. They sell different blends where basically there's a mix of Timothy grass and clover and alfalfa to get a good base for your trees, and then go ahead and plant your trees the following year. So I mean, I've made the mistakes, and so now I'm dialing back what I want to get done in the multi-year fashion. Because if we look at it this way, a lot of our deer seasons are even planned on a one season approach. Everything's make or break one season. Like, oh, this is the biggest deer I have to hunt, I got to kill him. And it's like, well, man, could you imagine if maybe you waited or bet on the deer the following year, maybe your following season would be twofold as good because of, whatever happens. And I think that comes down to the same thing with land management and planning, to where we always look at what's this year, what all can I get done? But if you stretch it out in a long-term vision, you're going to be way more productive. Because I've made like all these different mistakes of just trying to get as much done as fast as possible. And it's like, gosh, I wish I could do that again. And sometimes I do have to do it again because it didn't work.
So you did the rushing the trees mistake, and now they've been stunted. What are some of the other mistakes you've made over recent years that were, real doozies that now you look back on and say, man, I should have done that differently? What are a few more of those worst mistakes that you've learned from?
Not listening to my own gut. I remember the first farm I bought, there was a blind already on it. And the best way to explain it was, it's kind of a longer north to south food plot. and it was on the east side of the plot, which makes sense from a wind perspective, but you would have to walk through the plot in order to get to the blind. And you're putting a bunch of ground set in it. And I remember the first time I even walked, I was like, the blind really needs to be over here. It'd be really nice to put like a 2-track road in. And so I didn't do that the first year. And then the next year, I said, okay, I'm just going to do it. I know this is something that needs to happen. And so I moved the blind, put in the 2-track road. And then actually the first sit I had on that line, I ended up killing a buck doing exactly what I had initially envisioned in my head, that I don't necessarily think it would have worked if I would have left it where it was at. So I think a lot of the mistakes are just not doing what you know you need to do. And maybe that's easier for some people than others. But if there was you hunted all season, like, man, they all come out of this corner of the field, and I don't know why that is. And I wish I could get over there, but this or this doesn't allow me to do it. If there is a way to make it happen and you notice that's what's always occurring during the season, make the move and plan for it. And it's November every single year at the same time. Like, we all make it happen. It's going to happen. This upcoming November is going to happen. And when you realize this November, you wish it was set up that way, use this time to actually do that. Or another example would be at my house. We used to be an old cattle pasture, and there's a lot of interior fencing, which is actually pretty cool that that's already in place. And I remember thinking, they all come out of this north corner of it, and it would be really nice if on this corner of this creek, if they could cross right there. And so I just cut out a chunk of the fence, and sure enough, all the deer, like it's more of a split thing. I didn't plug up the other one, but it made a big impact. And so it's just, a lot of it is just, I would encourage people to think back on their past season and think really hard and say, what did I notice? What could I do to improve things and just do it, whatever that is. Do the self-research, figure it out, call a buddy, figure out, you've done this project. This is another thing I do all the time. I call other guys that have done the projects I'm trying to do, and you give them a call. Hey, I know you planted some warm season grasses 2 years ago. What would you do differently? I did this, and oh man, I definitely wouldn't do that again. And like, okay, well, I'm definitely going to take your advice here and do the different thing here. And I think all of it comes down to prep work, which is the boring thing. Like when you paint a house or paint your room, you got to put up all the tape. You have to lay out a foundation or the cloth. Like, man, this is going to take forever. And then you give the paint sprayer, and it's like, and it's all done. And I feel like the whitetail work is a lot of the putting up painter's tape, and then the fun is actually the painting. And it's important to have the foundation ready to go.
Man, that's so true. So you did you mentioned the one set of trees you planted that were stunted because of the growth. You mentioned another 2,000 or some that you're planting here in the future. I meant to ask you, what, other than not planting them in straight rows and now planting them in this prepped meadow of sorts with that mix you mentioned, what else are you doing different, or what specifically are you doing with this new forest you're planting to make sure that it does, pan out the way you want it to? So what species are you planting? When are you doing it? How are you doing it? Anything else around the details there? Because I think there's a lot of guys that, have these big open spaces and they're trying to figure out, what do you do with that? And like you said, there's like the quick fix things, but trees take time. And a lot of folks, steer away from that because they want that give me something right now kind of impact. So with the trees, what's the right way to do it, or how are you trying to?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a pretty interesting case study that I did this past year in comparison to the previous year. So I used a dibble bar. And so a dibble bar is like a little spade. You push it down with your boot and open up a little pocket, and then stick the tree in there and then close it up. And what happens, you have to trim up the roots a bunch. And so a J root is when it curls back up and the tree's going to die. So you have to trim the roots in order to fit into these tiny little holes. And so I went down to the hardware store and rented a steel auger. It's probably like 30, 40 pounds. It's a gas operated auger. I rented that for the weekend, and it makes a 8-inch hole. You can put it a lot deeper. And I quickly realized I needed to buy one of those because there's no way I was going to get everything done in a weekend. And so this past year, I used an auger for 90% of my trees. And so I did not have to trim up the roots hardly at all. Nice. And there's some Chickasaw plums, American plums that I planted this year, hazelnut that I planted this year. That's already taller than me. I'm 6 foot tall, and they're already taller than me. And they started out as little 4-foot bare roots or 3-foot bare roots.
All right, so they're 3 or 4 foot, and now they're already
6 foot, 6.5 foot, 7 foot. And comparing that to even some of the trees I used a dibble bar, where you had to trim up the roots, they have to regrow those roots. And I'm not a forester by any means, or arborist, but it's kind of common sense. They have to put a bunch of energy to reestablish the roots and then grow. But when you have a big old root ball and you put it into a nice soft soil all the way around it, they grew phenomenally better. And that was a very clear indication that it takes longer. It's more pain in the butt, but it's definitely worth it. And even I did use a tree planter for about 700 trees of the 4,000 I've planted. And same thing, you have to trim up the roots. And, it's side by side. I planted these trees the same weekend. And those ones did not hardly grow at all in comparison to the other ones that I took the time to use an auger and created a forest. And as far as different species, I love swamp oaks, swamp white oak. I planted a bunch of different varieties. I planted swamp white oak, which is a white oak variety. They hold their leaves really late. They have really sweet acorns. I planted pin oak, and that's a red oak variety. They hold their leaves really late. They grow pretty fast. And so it's actually pretty crazy to think I have all these different species and I'm hand selecting where each one of them go. And I planted persimmons, different types of plums, hazelnut, red dogwood, gray dogwood, planted some weird stuff like an annieberry, which I just wanted to see what those looked like when they got big and if the deer messed with them. And it's like all these different little things that you're just trying. And to be able to hand select where, okay, I want a shrub line along the creek of the red dogwood where they should thrive. And then I want a band of swamp white oak. And then I want to put hazelnut in a little bit more upland area and just hand select all these different little pockets. And then I'll see whatever is most desirable. But I think one of the plants I like the most is actually the plums because they grow really fast and they start to put out fruit in 3 to 4 or 5 years. And I think that's somewhat of the instant gratification side of things, but they also don't live super long either. So I think their lifespan's 15 to 20 years. And then also planting just a bunch of white oaks. And I've just had the luxury of walking a lot of different farms. And I just get to see the different stages of maybe an old abandoned CRP field where it's maybe 20 years old and you have a bunch of white oaks and all, shingle oaks, pin oaks. And it always looks really good. And they usually have really good deer.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen by accident. Someone took the time to do that. And whoever ends up hunting that farm 20 years later gets to reap the benefits of that. And it's just a long-term plan. It's a very long-term plan, and it's extremely gratifying to do that. And I think depending on where you're at, this is probably one of the biggest tips for someone. The state forestries sell tree species at a very affordable price. So Illinois has a sale, and you have to be ready to go right when it goes live because a lot of the good species sell right away. Missouri has another really good sale. Iowa has a really good sale where you can get these tree species that are really desirable and they'll ship them to your door, and they're very affordable than going to a nursery or buying them somewhere online. And I think that's where I pretty much, but based off what I buy is what's available that year because they're growing these bare root trees and then they're selling it to conservationists. And I think it's a really great resource if you want to buy a bundle of 100, it's $60 for a lot of species or $35 for a shrub species. Yeah. And those are a big thing. The other thing too, that I know a lot of guys have not, I tubed all my trees. And so aesthetically, it's kind of a little ugly to be honest, but I know long-term I'll be able to take them off. But if I planted some where I did not tube them and they got ate to the ground, or I planted some shrubs that were 2-foot tall tubes and they're still 2 foot tall. And I don't think they'll ever get taller than 2 foot because they're 2 feet because the deer just browse them right away. So I think the biggest thing is protecting those trees. I planted some fruit trees. I've not produced any fruit yet, but one mistake I did was I did not put you put a window screen around the base of the tree because in the winter, rabbits can go in and girdle your fruit tree. Mm-hmm. And I've made that mistake. And so it's just a lot of different things. But that's the crazy thing about whitetail land management. We just have only talked about trees and shrubs. Right. And there's a bunch of stuff we haven't covered that is so important to have a successful project. But tubing them, prepping the site, I think using an auger is worthwhile, and just sit back and watch them grow. And it's very gratifying.
So one of the questions that I have wrestled with in the past when I have been able to do stuff on a property, and that I get whenever I talk to people who are curious about doing this themselves, And I guess I'm kind of going to re-ask a question I already asked you once. I'm going to ask it a slightly different way. But when someone's trying to decide where my biggest weak spot is on my property, right? I've got a new farm, or I have a farm that I just haven't been able to do a lot of stuff on. But this is the year I'm finally going to really work on the place. I'm going to do something. I'm going to make it better this year. But to your point, like, gosh, there's all this stuff we just talked about with trees. And then, of course, food plots get a lot of press and they're really exciting and sexy. And then you talked about grasses and we've talked about access routes and all that kind of stuff. I'm wondering from like a process standpoint or like a high level standpoint, how do you recommend someone, determining where to start? I mean, you said earlier, access. Is it, excuse me, I'm dying over here. Is access always number one, or is there something else or a different process someone can go through to decide, okay, where's my weak spot or where's my area of most need? How do you think through that?
I think every farm has the best spot. I think you start there. And the best spot may be a tree stand or a blind that you can hunt. You hear people talk about, I can hunt that blind every day of the season and not get busted. And okay, well, that's pretty interesting. But what about the other best spot that the access is not that great? Where I killed my deer this year, the access was not that great. And I hunted it one time and it worked. And so, and how that works is I stayed the heck out of there until the conditions were perfectly right. It needed an east wind. I really wanted it to fall between the 5th or 12th of November. It was in between two bedding areas. And to make that, I guess, to boil that down is start with the best spot and then identify how often can I hunt it and when should I hunt it? And is there things that I can do to improve it? And I think that, someone that's just starting with something brand new, a lot of times the best spot is probably a location that has pretty solid access, maybe a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6 out of 10. And then how can you go in there and improve that? Maybe that is a micro food plot. Maybe that is felling a couple trees to try to get them to go where they were, dictate that traffic just a little bit better. Maybe not anything crazy drastic, but just a little way to up your odds. I think and maybe, do you experience this when you look at a farm? Do you just automatically gravitate towards maybe one or two spots of like, oh yeah, these are two really good spots based off of the sign, based off like, I feel like as hunters, it automatically kind of comes to us to some
It's
degree.
hard not to. Yeah. It's hard not to do that. Oh, but also I think sometimes the opposite is possible, which is you gravitate towards where the easiest place to make an improvement would be, right? I think like you might look at a property like, well, there's my opening. Like there's already an open spot. That's where I'll do the food plot because food plots are fast and they're exciting and there's an open spot. And so this is like a mistake I've made in the past where I got access to a property I could improve and there was already an opening in a spot. And I thought, all right, that's it. That's going to be the first thing I do. I'm going to plant a big old food plot here in this open spot. And I go and do it. And then lo and behold, it's right along the route I need to access. And every time I try to go in for a morning hunt, I'm spooking deer off this food plot. And, 2 years later, I had to just let the whole thing go because I realized it was making things worse for me than it was in the, actually helping me. So I've made that mistake. So I have struggled with answering this question myself, I guess.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the actual. I'm trying to just go through my own thought process here because I think that sometimes not doing a bunch of stuff is just as powerful as doing a bunch of stuff. And I think you're exactly right. That open area, oh, it'd be great. It'd be so easy to put in a food plot. But to your point, it may be more productive to leave it the way it is or improve it. Because I think all whitetail, if you have a piece that you can mess around with, you're a tinkerer by default. You want to tinker, you want to tweak everything, you want to improve everything. And I have this internal debate quite often. It's like, I wonder how good that farm would be if it stayed exactly the way it is and I just stayed the heck out of it. And I had to think I had a new permission piece where I tested that theory and it worked. And then I would think like, and the whole time I was like, man, it'd be so nice to have a food plot, right over there that wouldn't have to dive as deep. And I think that a lot of times it just comes down to making the spot as effective as possible without doing stuff just because it looks really good. Because we all get caught up in the aesthetic of a farm. Oh, it's so pretty. Do you see that food plot? You see how green that food plot is? Or it's just all these different things that we think as humans and not necessarily as how the deer would perceive that when you put a really nice green food source right next to a giant alfalfa field. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, was that really worthwhile? But I think the biggest thing is figuring out where the best spot is and then reverse engineering to maybe how to make it a little bit better and kind of going all into one spot. Because I think a lot of the theme from so many of the guys that I've talked to, one thing that is pretty common is they're aggressive in the sense of hunting when the time is right and making it happen with whatever mousetrap they developed or maybe working with what they have. But they're not aggressive in the sense of it's November 5th. I have to get to this exact center of my farm on this one ridge point where I think it's going to happen. They're very disciplined and very patient. And I think that's the hardest thing as hunters across the board because they listen to Cody DeQuist, like, oh, he's got to get in there, he's got to do that. Or you listen to Dan Infall, if you're passive on a deer, you're teaching them. And like that's in the back of your mind. But then you also understand that there's a tried and true method of just sticking to a disciplined plan and trusting that plan. And I think that where you get in trouble is where you start towing the line between both of them. Like, yeah, I think I'm going to dive back in there and like, oh, I'm going to stick back to my plan. And it's like, well, you might have shot yourself in the foot there. And that's something I battle all the time is, oh, you got to get in there. You got to do it. And then at the same point, like, okay, I tried that. Now I'm going to go back to the more disciplined version. And then it is like, you almost have to be all in on one or the other. It almost seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also so circumstantial, right? Like some people, like if you have just one little farm,
Yeah.
a certain way of hunting it might be very different than if you hunt 3 farms worth 3,000 acres, right? Like Cody can bounce around to a whole bunch of different places, right? That are all great. Or Dan can bump around thousands of acres to different public land that he's hunting and scouted. But if I tried that same attempt on my 20 acres that is the only spot I hunt, it's not going to work out so well. So you need to understand, like, okay, certain tactics work best in certain types of situations, and understanding if you are fitting a square peg into a round hole or not.
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest piece of advice that's not land management, but it kind of works out in the same fashion. Go get permission on a few more spots or go find a couple public places that you can burn some hunts on. And sometimes not hunting your farm is just as productive as hunting it. And I think that a lot of guys fall into this trap to, I have to hunt it. I have the week off. I really want to go. And that's fine because you have someone that says you got to be out there to kill them. And I question if those are the guys that are killing the deer or the quality of deer that they really want to. I mean, if we're being completely honest, and I think that where guys struggle is they have to hunt it because they have to. And I think just leaving farms fresh as possible. And then you did the post. My whole ethos this upcoming season or this last season, just follow my gut. It's like really simple. If you listen to Whitetail podcasts, you're ate up by this. You know what to do. Just follow your gut and don't overthink it. And I caught myself where the hunts where I would just go in on a gut feeling and just kind of just go a little bit more instinctual, way more productive. And then I would catch myself in the stand thinking, okay, tomorrow is going to be a southwest wind. What are some good south wind spots? And just like really overthinking it. And then I'd go do that. And it's like, man, I went here just because I thought it would be good in my own brain. And in reality, I just talked myself into thinking it would be good. And I think that comes down to the land management side of it. Comes down to everything. It's like follow your instincts, follow your intuition, and do what you need to do. And maybe that's not doing anything, or maybe that's doing a lot if something needs to get done that could drastically improve a parcel.
Yeah. With the hunting tactic, like you're talking about, like, should I hunt here? Should I hunt there? You can get feedback on your decision pretty quickly, right? You can go out there and hunt today, and then you can determine, like, did I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing? So it's a very fast turnaround as far as understanding your decision-making process and if it paid off or not. When it comes to land management, though, you can do something today, and can you see a difference next year, or is it 2 years, or is it 10 years? How like what kind of timeline do you recommend someone looking at these things on, and how quickly could someone expect to see positive changes, see progress?
That's a fascinating question because you're right. That feedback loop is a lot longer. Man, that's an excellent question. I think some things you could see an improvement on rather quickly. And I think a lot of it is just a response of nature and habitat. Like, for instance, I killed a bunch of that fescue and brome grass, and then I did a controlled burn, and I had a bunch of new oak seedlings popping up out of the ground the following spring. Now, how does that relate to hunting? It creates better brow, like all these different things. But I think the feedback loop, that is an excellent question. I don't know when the time is to pull the plug or say that, yeah, this isn't working, because a lot of it does take time. You can't make 3-year-old switchgrass in 1 year, no matter what you do.
Right.
And I think a lot of it's just trusting the process and then having enough self awareness to say, okay, this didn't work. How can I improve it? I don't know when you would pull the plug. I think the biggest thing would be if you think a stand location is really good because of the postseason scouting, and you go in there, and then the following fall you hunt it 2 or 3 times and you get busted, this isn't a really good example, is the wind does something drastically different than what you thought, to where it swirls on. I thought it'd be good for a north and west, a north and south wind, but on a south wind it seems to swirl back over to where I didn't think it would go. And I think that isn't necessarily changing anything. It's maybe just not hunting it on a south wind, but that comes back to a quicker feedback loop. I honestly don't have a firm answer on when to pull the plug on a project. I think, like, for example, the tree side of things, going into the first year, there was not much bedding or activity around it, but following year there was more. And then this year, there was even more. There was actually one sit that was pretty fun. I was sitting there, I had does around me, and I just hear this plastic like crashing, like whack. I'm like, and I'm pinned down. There's does all around me. And I'm like, what is that? And I ended up being able to pull up my binoculars, and there's this like junker old mature buck just smashing all my tree tubes and offset and snapping them all off. And so, I mean, and there's a corner of my planting where there's 15 trees that got snapped off, like the stake that planted the trees. And that was pretty fun to actually witness and hear it. And I had a camera down there, and I watched the cameras all bristled up. And so, I mean, that took 3 years for that to occur. And so I think the biggest thing just comes down to patience. And I think the other side of that is having a plan that you have a lot of conviction in. If you're wishy-washy on the plan, you're probably not going to see it through, and you're going to say, I did this wrong. I don't know. And like, people are constantly changing things before it would get good. And I think that's something that is probably a hard thing to battle. It just comes down to having a good plan and having conviction in that. And easier said than done, once again.
Well, what makes a good plan then?
I feel that it would boil down to what your goals would be. Because I think for some people, the plan would be, this farm doesn't really hold any deer. I would just really like to go out, and when I hunt, just see deer. Or I would like to be able to hunt this blind and have a 7 out of 10 chance to shoot a doe. And I think that plan's a lot easier and a much quicker feedback loop. I think the other side, I think it's so situational to where, and I battled this initially, where my idea of how I wanted to change the landscape was whitetail specific. What is simply the best for whitetails? I don't care what the implications are. I just want it to be the absolute best for whitetails. And as I started doing more research and getting deeper into it, it's like, well, maybe I could dial that back, and it'd be kind of cool to plant this in a pollinator, and it'd be pretty cool to plant, I've planted quite a bit of native grasses, and I had a pheasant once, and I hadn't seen a pheasant forever. I'm like, okay, that's pretty cool. And so it's so situational to where there are guys it's whitetail specific only, and that's all I care about. And then there's other folks that have different varying levels of expectations. But the biggest thing is understanding what possibly the ceiling or maybe glass ceiling would be on a farm, and being ultra realistic with that, which is hard to do. And I think that's something that just comes with time. I mean, initially when I moved on 40 acres, like, oh man, I can't. I'd love to shoot a Boone and Crockett whitetail behind my house. I don't think that's probably realistic in a 10-year timeline. Maybe a 20-year timeline, maybe it is. But there's other farms where that expectation could be a once in a 5-year occurrence. And how you would develop a farm would probably cater to what the quality of the deer in the neighborhood. So that's why I kind of dialed back some of the whitetail side of things of, okay, it's probably, it's going to be a really fun place to hunt. I'm really going to enjoy it, but I probably don't have to be so extreme and do everything to the 10th degree. And maybe that's a mistake, but once again, that's the beauty of all of this, is you get to cater it to what you want. And
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is being realistic to what you want and what is realistic and meshing those two things together.
Yeah. So you alluded to this earlier, the fact that, in your own podcast, you've talked to all sorts of people about these topics. You've talked to, the best land consultants, land managers, whitetail habitat tacticians. I mean, you've talked to them all. And I've talked to a bunch of them too. And one thing I've noticed about many of these folks is they tend to be very, and now this isn't a rule, there are exceptions to this, but many of them, I want to figure out how to put this properly. Um, they're a little bit black and white. There's a lot of them that are like, this is the way to do it. If you don't do it this way, you're a knucklehead.
Yeah.
There's a handful who are very opinionated in that kind of way, and they're all great. Like they're all doing their thing very well. So I'm not saying that their way of doing things doesn't work, but there seem to be a bunch of different ways that work, from what I've noticed from afar. So
Uh,
I'm curious, from your perspective, having kind of specialized in this area more than I have, um, what are some of the things that have stood out to you as consistencies across the board, across all of these people? Are there any things that stand as like the absolute pillars of success for land management? That whether it's Joe, John, Bill, or Bob, everyone believes this kind of stuff?
yeah. And you're right. There's a lot of, I always, oftentimes when I look at something like, how would so and so look at this? And then I would go to the, what would so and so think about this? And just kind of go down the list.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a couple of things that all ring true. They all treat their properties like a glass house. And I think that that's wise. I mean, that's just like
Yeah.
a lot of this. I think a lot of the shortcomings could be from the person looking in the mirror and how you hunt and utilize a farm. And so I think the biggest thing that they do is they treat things like a glass house. And something that I want to do with the Master Academy is actually have like 3 or 4 different consultants come out and all do a plan and then compare them all. And I
Yeah.
think there would be a lot more common things than not, maybe even more than what they would realize. And I think those would be leaving. It's okay to leave a lot of your farm alone. It's okay to not improve every single square inch of your farm. To every open area has to be food, or every open area has to be converted to bedding. It's okay to maybe leave a 2-acre field into a, something that's fallow that allows you to access your property. I think all those plans would match up showcasing that. The other thing too is they're all very disciplined, to your point, with what they do, but they're disciplined to, if you think about it, they all have success, right? So that means it's working. But they're all very methodical and disciplined to what that plan is. And I
Yeah.
think that where you get in trouble is you just take a little bit from here, a little bit from here, and you don't realize that they maybe contradict what needs to happen, but you want to scratch both itches is probably one shortcoming. But I think the biggest thing is they leave their farm alone, a lot of their farm alone, and they don't have to improve every square inch. And you don't need 20 good spots. You need 1 or 2 good spots. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. And something that I always like to ask people if I'm on their farm, like, what's your favorite spot on the farm? And the reason I always like to ask that, and they're like, well, like my favorite spot for killing a deer. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So if where can you go? You have the perfect ideal conditions. Where do you like to go? And then, show me on the map or let's go look at it. And typically it comes down to really good access with a good food source that's nearby. And so if you can reverse engineer that, you need one really good spot with those items versus, I mean, where I live, I have 2 spots I hunt, maybe 3. And one of the spots I haven't hunted in 2 years because there hasn't been a deer I wanted to shoot. But the point being is like, just have some absolute dialed in spots and make those great. And I think that we all want to see what's over the next hill. We all want to see, I wonder what's happening over there. And thankfully with cameras, a lot of those questions can be answered, and whether people want to admit it or not, real time to what's going on. But the biggest thing is discipline. They leave a lot of their farm alone and they treat it like a glass house, and they have a plan and they stick to it. But they all come down to good cover, good food, and leave your deer alone. I mean, that's the 3 things that they all agree on. However you get to those 3 things, they all agree with those are the 3 really important
Yeah.
items.
That makes sense. And I would say that stands out to me too. I'm curious about the flip side, which would be what are some of the things that stand out to you as most unique? So are there any off the wall ideas that you've heard from someone over the years that you've talked to? You've walked a lot of people's farms, you've talked to all these guys on your podcast. Um, do any off the wall ideas stand out to you still as like, man, this one crazy thing that Jeff said, or this one wild idea from Bobby, or anything like that that stands out to you is particularly unique and that you think really has some validity to it or that you've been able to implement and see work for you?
There's a couple things that more than one thing. One of them was I was with Bobby Kendall earlier this past summer. And he had 3 stands in one spot. 3 stands for all different
Yeah.
wins. So there was the spot within the spot, and it was actually exactly what I described. Really good bedding, transitioning to really good food, and he had 3 different stands for 3 different wins. I don't know too many other people that would go to that lengths to have it set up for that exact scenario. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's pretty genius. And it's had me question like, I wonder what other spots if you could, instead of being on that side of the trail or that side of the cover, what could you do to make it work more often if it is the best spot?
Right.
Another one that's really interesting. Ironically, I was just on this farm this morning actually. Um, Bill Winkie came out to a client of mine's property, and there's a cabin, and then it comes out to where it's a really big cliff, and then it goes into a bedding area. And he's like, you need to put a 40-foot extension ladder right here so you can access down there. And I was like, really? He was dead serious. And that was Bill's idea. And I said, that is definitely to the level of extreme I don't think I would have thought of.
Yeah.
I just sold a farm, and I was walking with the seller, and it's kind of the inverse of this. He had a rope off the side of a big steep hill because we walked back there, and I was like, man, how the heck do you get back here? He's like, I was waiting for you to ask that. He has a rope, and he pulls himself up this giant hill to come up off a cliff face, basically, to
Wow.
get to where he needs to go. And that, ironically, unprovoked, came up as this is my favorite spot on the farm. And so it's like
Interesting.
we all know within our own brains of what's the best spot, and then those are a couple creative ways to make it
Make it
much
work.
more realistic. Which I mean, kind of extreme. Those are a couple of extreme examples, but I wouldn't have thought of either of those. I may have thought of the pull-up rope, but I don't think I would actually do it. I'd probably be like, oh, what about this ridge over here?
Right. I got a buddy who's always said he's wanted to develop a whitetail zipline system for access.
Yeah.
If anyone ever figures that one out, that might be useful to get into certain spots.
I bet you there's some whitetail tunnels across the country that we do not know about, to where you go underneath this little tunnel to get to the backside of a blind. I bet you somewhere across the country that is a thing. So
Someone's figured it out.
yeah, if someone's creative enough to do that,
Yeah.
more power to them.
Man. All right. So if someone is chomping at the bit to do this kind of work and they're excited for the new year, they really want to make some positive changes on their farm this year. Do you have any resources you would recommend folks check out? Are there any books or videos or particular podcasts or episodes that you've done or anything at all that you would send folks to kind of get this planning process rolling?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for a lot of folks that are newer to this would be utilize the free resources that are out there, and that would be your local NRCS office. And so
Yeah.
they have Pheasants Forever biologists, and I've utilized these a lot personally. And I had a concern going into that, to where they'd be like, yeah, you're kind of a deer hunter. That's kind of weird. Like, we only really care about nature. But they've all been extremely accommodating to, they suggest something like, well, that's great, but how could we tweak that plan to make it more whitetail centric? They usually have a suggestion beyond that. So I think utilizing the NRCS office, the free biologists, um, utilize the equip contracts that are available to do a lot of this work. The first year I planted like 1,000 shrubs and trees, I paid for all of it out of pocket because I was not aware that I could get cost share on that. And I think that's one of the biggest things. The one thing I would say is be patient with them. Like, they're busy folks, and they have, they're all spread really thin. So I think utilizing those would be one of the biggest things. And navigating equip contracts is something that is pretty challenging to do for the first time. And so a shameless plug would be the Whitetail Master Academy, where break down equip contracts. What do you need to ask? A lot of this, like, you need to know what questions you need to ask in order to get the outcome that you would like, because a lot of it is unique and changing for the NRCS offices. And so that's something that I would encourage folks to look at. And there's a bunch of different land plans from Don Higgins, like over 20 land plans. And so you kind of get the ability to look at different farms, maybe find one that is similar to what you're working with, and maybe you get an idea or two and make a big difference. And I think those are some of the bigger items that I really enjoy. When it comes to just the pure native species and establishing those grasses, things of that nature, I really like the Prairie Farm podcast, which they talk about. They really nerd out on the different varieties of grasses and things of that nature. And so you kind of get an idea of the different processes and the ecological benefits. And a lot of this, you always start as a whitetail hunter. And I have no doubt by the end of it, you will be a true conservationist by the end of it. And you will get excited about little oak trees growing that I never thought I would get excited about. You'd get really excited about a clump of Indian grass that responded after a prescribed burn. And so the basis of it is to hunt and kill big deer more consistently. But you will find along the journey a lot of different things that you will really enjoy. And you get to talk to different biologists that have different backgrounds and maybe they walk your farm, like, oh, this is a very rare species. This is really cool. I haven't seen one of these in 3 years. Well, that's pretty cool, right? And so to start the process, and I think that utilize your NRCS office, utilize foresters. Once again, be persistent. They're spread thin. Where I'm at, the part of the state where I'm at, there's very few of them. So it's kind of hard to pin one down, but utilize those free resources and check out the Whitetail Master Academy, check out the Prairie Farm podcast. And there's so many different things that I consistently tune into. I mean, there's some really good YouTube channels out there. It'd be a disservice to name any, because there's a lot of them that are really good. And also, surprisingly, Facebook groups can be really good too. I'm in a group that is just switchgrass Facebook.
That's amazing.
That's so niche.
I doubt Mark Zuckerberg imagined that when he built Facebook. Like, someday there will be people congregating here to debate switchgrass varieties.
Yeah, and it's crazy because people will take a picture of their stand and say, "Hey, what do I need to do to improve it?" And there's guys that have been planting switchgrass for 25 years, and they're like, "Oh, you need to mow this or spray this or wait till next year." And so, like, a lot of these resources are out there. You just got to figure out what gets you excited and get out the old Google machine and start going and learning and applying and be comfortable to make mistakes and be have enough. I don't want to say all this. A lot of this comes down to there's a lot of ego in all of this,
Sure.
based off of me. Like, I'm just speaking generally, like me identifying, like, I need to learn more about this. Like, I don't know as much as I really should, and just lower the ego and just go and learn as much as possible and utilize all these different resources and have fun. Like, at the end of the day, have fun doing it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Whitetail Master Academy. You've got the Land podcast. Can you just give folks a quick rundown of where they can access these things?
Yeah. So whitetailmasteracademy.com. We have new videos every single week. Land plan from Don Higgins once a month. And we actually have virtual live events. For example, we have Dr. Bronson Strickland on this evening. You can ask Dr. Bronson Strickland any question you've ever wanted to, which is a pretty cool format to be able to do that. The Land podcast, you can find that wherever you find podcasts. And then also a lot of the audio version, the video versions on my YouTube channel, it's just my name, Jake Hofer. So those are the places you can find all the different exciting things that get me excited, and hopefully people find value in.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate Jake. Great catching up, great talking land, and I'm excited to get to work on my plan for this year too, even more so now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and that's going to do it for us today. Thank you for joining me here on the podcast. Thanks for being a part of this community. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.